On 3 August 2016, an Emirates Boeing 777 landing in Dubai attempted a last-second go-around after touching down too far along the runway. The pilots pulled up to climb and activated go-around mode, but the plane quickly lost speed and crashed back onto the runway. The fully loaded 777 slid across Dubai International Airport on its belly for almost a kilometer before it ground to a halt and burst into flames. Despite a chaotic evacuation that took much longer than it was supposed to, all 300 passengers and crew managed to escape with their lives. Tragically, the miracle of their survival was dampened just minutes later, when an explosion ripped through the plane, killing a firefighter. So what caused the worst accident in Emirates' 35-year history? In 2020, authorities in the United Arab Emirates released a report that outlined a complex sequence of events that led to the near disaster. There were miscommunications between the pilots and air traffic control. The weather was abnormal. The landing was unusually long. But at the center of the story was one of the most common dangers in aviation today, the over-reliance of pilots on sophisticated automation that they don't fully understand. Emirates Flight 521 was a regularly scheduled flight from Tiruvananthapuram, India, to Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. Tiruvananthapuram, located at the southern tip of India, is one of many cities in the region served by the UAE's flag carrier Emirates, and flights from here to Dubai are usually filled with Indian workers and their families heading to the Gulf states for work. Flight 521 was certainly no exception. At Tiruvananthapuram's Trivandrum International Airport, 282 passengers boarded the wide-body Boeing 777, almost all of them Indian nationals. Joining them on the flight were 2 pilots and 16 flight attendants, adding up to exactly 300 people on board. The captain, who has not been named, hailed from the United Arab Emirates. The first officer, Jeremy Webb, was from Australia. Both were utterly average pilots. Their records were largely indistinguishable from those of thousands of other pilots around the world. On an airline like Emirates, this should have been sufficient comfort. In fact, Emirates had not suffered a single aircraft loss or fatal accident since its founding in 1985, and it has consistently ranked in the top 10 safest airlines worldwide. At 10:06 a.m. Indian time, Emirates Flight 521 lifted off from Trivandrum International Airport and climbed out over the Arabian Sea, headed northwest toward the UAE. All was normal throughout the 3.5-hour flight, until Flight 521 began its approach into Dubai shortly before 12:30 p.m. local time. Weather at Dubai that day was rather unusual. A high-pressure system had brought scorching temperatures as high as 49 C, 120 F, while 2 low-pressure systems off the coast drew a hot wind outward from the high-pressure zone toward the sea. This wind collided head-on with the normal sea breeze that moves inland from the Persian Gulf every morning, stalling its movement directly over Dubai International Airport. Flight 521's assigned runway 12 left had an approximately 13-knot tailwind. However, runway 30 right, the same runway from the opposite direction, also had a tailwind of similar magnitude, a bizarre situation by all accounts. This caused wind shear, a sudden change in wind speed and/or direction, to develop in the middle of the runway. In the minutes before Flight 521 lined up to land, 2 flights were forced to abort their landings after encountering wind shear. However, they didn't tell the controller their reasons for doing so, and the controller didn't ask. Nor was any information about these missed approaches conveyed to the pilots of Emirates Flight 521, who were only expecting light to moderate wind shear based on the available weather reports. Despite the tailwind, the pilots of Flight 521 encountered no problems during final approach, and at 12:37, the plane arrived over the runway threshold at a normal speed and altitude. But from that moment, a rapid-fire sequence of events began to send the plane off course. The pilots raised the nose to flare the plane slightly too early, extending the glide. The extreme heat of the runway surface, which had risen to a blistering 68 C, 154 F, caused thermals to rise upward off the ground, further reducing the plane's descent rate. Finally, at an altitude of about 10 feet, the plane flew straight into the wind shear. The tailwind suddenly transitioned to a headwind, and within the space of a few seconds, the plane's airspeed increased by 12 knots, 22 kilometers per hour. This in turn increased the lift generated by the wings, extending the glide even more. The plane barely descended at all, skimming along just a few feet above the runway as the captain struggled to get it to touch down. Thermals, he exclaimed, mistakenly attributing the plane's increased performance to hot air rising off the runway. The first officer replied, check, indicating that he agreed about the presence of thermals. Moments later, a gust of wind blew the plane to the left, and the captain overcorrected to the right, causing the right main landing gear to momentarily touch the ground. By now, the captain feared that they would not be able to touch down within the prescribed touchdown zone, in which case Emirates procedures required him to perform a go-around and attempt the approach again. Just as both main landing gear bogies began to make contact with the runway, the captain called out, "Go around," and immediately began the go-around sequence. At exactly the same moment, a computerized voice called out, "Long landing," warning that they had taken too long to touch down. To make a go-around as simple as possible, the Boeing 777, like all modern jets, has two takeoff, go-around, or toga, switches on the throttle levers that a pilot can press in order to initiate a go-around. Pressing the toga switches will command the autothrottle to apply full power and will put the flight computer in go-around mode. However, the toga switches are inhibited on landing after touchdown, because if a pilot were to accidentally press it during rollout, it could cause the plane to run off the runway. The autothrottle system remains active, but if sensors detect that there is weight on the wheels, the toga switches simply won't do anything. To perform a go-around after touchdown, thrust must be increased manually. But when the captain of Flight 521 pushed the toga switches, he was unaware that the plane had touched down and that the button was inhibited. As he pulled the nose up to climb, the autothrottle failed to increase engine power. Normally, the takeoff configuration alarm would warn the pilots that they were not properly configured for a go-around, but in this case, its trigger conditions were not met. The configuration warning relied on the advancement of the throttles to detect that a go-around was happening in the first place, so it was impossible for it to sound due to insufficient thrust. As the captain pulled the nose up, the plane at first appeared to climb normally. The first officer called out "positive climb," and the captain retracted the landing gear. But neither pilot noticed that the flight computer hadn't changed modes and that their speed was dropping rapidly. Seeing that Flight 521 appeared to be making a missed approach, the controller told him to climb out straight ahead to 4,000 feet, and the first officer acknowledged. But within seconds, the plane's rate of ascent slowed and its speed dropped. Without sufficient thrust to sustain a climb, Flight 521 reached an altitude of 85 feet, then began to fall back toward the runway. The ground proximity warning blared, "Don T sink." The captain realized that they must have encountered wind shear and manually applied max power, in accordance with the wind shear escape maneuver, calling out "wind shear, toga," as he did so. Only now did he realize that the autothrottle hadn't applied go-around power. Unfortunately, this realization came far too late. Before its engines could finish spooling up, the Boeing 777 slammed back down onto the runway with its landing gear stowed. The hard impact sent unsecured objects flying in every direction as the 300 passengers and crew held on for dear life. The huge plane slid down the runway on its belly and engines for 800 meters, throwing up a trail of sparks. The right engine sheared off and became lodged in front of the wing as it plowed over the runway edge lights. Finally, the 777 spun around nearly 180 degrees and came to rest partially on a taxiway off the side of runway 12 left, surrounded by a cloud of dust and smoke. On board Flight 521, no one had been seriously hurt during the crash, but getting 300 people off the plane alive would not be simple. Fires quickly erupted on both engines and in the right main landing gear bay, sending white smoke pouring into the center of the cabin almost immediately. Up front, the captain got on the radio and said, "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday, Emirates 521, evacuating." The controller, who had witnessed the accident, sounded the crash alarm and alerted the airport's fire station, which scrambled to respond. Meanwhile, the pilots struggled to find their evacuation checklist amid the sea of random objects that had been strewn about the cockpit, requiring almost a full minute to locate it. But despite seeing fire and smoke outside the plane, the flight attendants didn't initiate an evacuation on their own, causing jams in the aisles as passengers used the wait to try to retrieve their luggage from the overhead bins. When the order to evacuate finally came, flight attendants began to open the exit doors to deploy the slides. Not everyone made it. As it came down, the wing section struck a firefighter, killing him instantly. The lead flight attendant and pilots were still on board at the time of the explosion and were thrown to the ground by the force of the blast. Peeling themselves off the floor, they abandoned any hope of searching the cabin for stragglers and jumped down from the L1 exit door, using the detached slide to break their fall. Like a true commander, the captain was the last person to leave the plane. We hope you enjoyed the video. Please subscribe, like, share and comment. Thanks for watching.